Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. And as Jose already said, we will have a very different type of colloquium than usually. So I will give a pretty short talk or presentation, and then Daniel, with whom we collaborate, will take over and make a short statement. Daniel, by the way, is presently a visiting scientific advisor in the German Ministry of Finance. And as I've heard, he just came back from a meeting with the chefs there. So we are also involved a little bit here in the Periscope EU cost initiative, was funded by Paolo, and we are looking there forward to vivid discussions. And so, as Jose said, in the end, since we have two short presentations, we would like to have plenty of discussions. So here you see the culprit, why we are talking today, the coronavirus, very famous by the way, and this is DNA in between, inside. Now let me start and say something generally about epidemic outbreaks. And let me start with the MERS outbreak in South Korea a few years ago, namely in 2015. And you see, as a function of time, there are cases here which rise, not very many cases, daily cases, and then they drop. Some people die here, and eventually the outbreak stops. So that is an archetypical outbreak. It starts and it finishes completely. So that is here's a picture of the MERS virus. You already see some features we already also have with the coronavirus, that normally that the going up is relatively fast and going down is slower. And you will see that also for the corona outbreak. Now, what we will also use a lot is an phase-space representation of epidemic outbreak. So we plot on the x-axis not the time, but the total number of cases. And on the y-axis is usually the new daily cases. And in this case, you have time is implicit, and every data point is one date. So one date here and one date there. And you see you have a nice parabola. The curve is a theoretical curve. The outbreak starts, has its maximum, and after a certain extension, it is finished. Now, in order to show you some data for the coronavirus, I will use a web page here, which we developed, and show you a little bit what's going on here. I will put you the link into the chat so that you can, where's the chat here? I think I have to stop sharing for putting it into the chat, sorry. Yeah. So, and now I'm sharing again and doing this now live. And so this is here our web page, the Goethe Interactive COVID-19 Analyzer, which has been very nicely developed by Fabian, a PhD student, and also by Caroline since a few weeks, but her name is not yet in. And so what you can do, you select a country. For example, you can select Germany. And then you see the usual timeline of the German corona infections, namely the first peak here in spring, and now the second wave. The main goal of this webpage is that you can compare. And let me just start with an example. I'm adding here Germany another time. Now I have data points which are exactly the same. But now I want to compare cases, for example, with deaths. So I put here that I want to have the deaths. Now the red line are the deaths, which are of course much, much smaller in number. So what I have to do now, I have to scale the y-axis of the deaths up. So if I scale the y-axis up, then I can make a comparison and see how the timeline goes. Now, of course, the deaths come a little bit later. So I want to see how much later. so make a time shift here, and I shift by about 12 days. And if I shift about 12 days, then I see that the number of disease follow very nicely the number of officially reported cases. And what do we learn about? First of all, the scaling factor, which is about 23 here, the scaling between the official cases and the people who die. And now, if we go here to the second wave, we see that we have a substantial lower number of people dying than the infectious. Now you may say, oh, because the people die later, but we already shifted the deaths by 12 days. And now generally, one assumes that there are two reasons that we have these low death counts. One is that mostly young people are infected. And the other reason is that people take a little bit more care. So when you get infected, you get a lower load, so lower number of viruses than here in springtime, when people didn't yet know. You would get a full load of the virus. And if you get a small load of the virus, your immune system is more able to cope with the disease. Okay, we can also compare two countries, and let's compare Germany with Italy, because it's always said that Italy is so much worse, has been hit so much worse than Germany. This representation here is in incidence, so per 100,000, but we can shift also, of course, to absolute number. In absolute number, of course, Italy has a little bit smaller population. There's nearly no difference here. But Germany is a little bit later, and we can also test, of course, how much later Germany was. And we shift that, and we see that Germany was about 6 days later. That is, of course, very important, because these 6 days gave us time to prepare. But otherwise, you see, it's hardly possible to distinguish Germany with Italy. They are twins regarding Corona, maybe now not anymore. And also very surprising is that now, after 6 months, when Italy goes up, Germany goes up. Now that is highly non-trivial, because if you take another country, for example, France, then this is not the case. France has a completely different timeline. The sloping up of the second wave began nearly 1.5 months earlier. So this is a web page that we developed for you, for everybody to be able to do their own analysis. The last thing I want to show is a different kind of scaling approach. And I'm adding here another time Italy. So I have 2 times Italy now. And I'm using also different representation, namely the phase-space representation I told you about. So on the y-x-axis, I have the total number of cases. And on the y-axis, the daily case. And here you see the normal archetypical outbreak of an epidemic. It goes and it's finished. But instead, in contrast to the MERS outbreak, Corona didn't really finish. It stayed a little bit, and now we have this second wave. So can we compare in this representation also the people who die? Now, of course, you see here, the people who die a much smaller number, so I have to scale. Now, I have to scale both y-axis and x-axis, and I can do that. Sorry, not the time shift, here. This, sorry, the scaling here, and I can scale them up. And if you do that, you see something pretty astonishing, namely that the people dying and the people officially reported to be ill scale exactly at the first peak, which is pretty important for theoretical modeling, because the death count is normally more reliable than the count of who is infected. Of course, there's some undercounting also for the death, but it's more reliable. And you see here a pretty nice scaling, and you also see that also for Italy, the death count doesn't affect at the moment the second wave. So you probably have seen anyhow lots of data for COVID-19, and I just wanted to show you maybe a few aspects which are a little bit new. And so thanks to Fabian and Caroline, we have this very nice webpage to do your own this analysis. And for the people who are studying physics, maybe I would like to know to say that, well, if you do physics, especially if you do theoretical physics, we expect you to be able to program such a web page. But now let's come to the theory, a few words to the theory. We have, for every infectious disease, the basic logic is actually very simple. So we start with people who are susceptible, so who can be infected. Now you're in contact with somebody, then you are ill. And if you're ill in a certain stage, you are infectious, so you can transmit the disease. And in the end of the day, you are either recovered or you are dead. And in the case, if you have a lifelong immunity like here, it doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? Because you're out of the game. You cannot transmit the disease anymore, whether you're recovered or dead. That is, of course, different if the immunity is limited. So if you have a limited time of immunity. And that plays not a major role, but a small role for COVID-19. You're susceptible, you're infectious, and then it makes a difference whether you're recovered or diseased, because if you're dead, you're out of the game. If you're recovered, well, after a certain period, you may become susceptible again. And essentially, all epidemiological modeling follows these basic logic. Of course, the models can be much more complicated, many more details, a huge number of agents, but the basic logic is always the same. So, and the basic model is called the SEER model, and the SEER model is for susceptible, infected, or infectious, and recovered. And there are three very simple equations for the time evolution of S, for the time evolution of I and R, and the logic is exactly the logic I explained to you before. So the number of susceptible decreases if somebody becomes infected, and you have to be, if a susceptible person meets an infected person, then you go out of the reservoir of susceptible and you join the people who are infected. As easy as that. There are just two variables, the time scale tau and the famous reproduction rate G, which we call G, or some people call R. And what is important also in the analysis is the total case count, which is just X minus S. And if you look at the time evolution, nothing very surprisingly, the number of infection as the number of time goes up and then goes down if nobody can be infected anymore. This point is often called the herd immunity point, when you reach the maximum. But here the herd immunity, you can look at the phase-based representation, so the total case count. And you see you start here, you end here until nobody can infect it anymore. But you also see that after the herd immunity point, there's still a substantial number of infections going on. So next, I would like to introduce you to the model we were using or introduced, which is a variant of the classical CM model called the control CM model. And the idea is, can we model containment policies? So that the fact that the reproduction factor is reduced either by social distancing, which comes spontaneously, or by government-imposed lockdown and containment policies. And the basic rationale is the following, that either the government or the people react to the total number of case counts, so it's a long-term perspective, or we already have 10,000 people died, or they react to the daily cases. Oh, today we had 300 new cases, so we have to do something. So either the feedback is a long-term perspective, the overall evolution, or the short-term perspective, you look what is going on right now. And if you do that, of course, you can reduce the disease. So here, this is here in violet, the normal evolution of an uncontrolled disease. In the end, you have 93% of the people of the whole population who have been infected if you assume a G factor of G0, bare GZ factor of 3. But if you have a control, here you have the case of long-term control, we can substantially reduce the epidemiologically, what is happening epidemiologically. And here in this case, the total number of cases in the end is much, much lower, 25% of the population, and then the disease is gone. And so, of course, this is theory, and people will want them to know how this plays out in practice. Before I do that, let us discuss a little bit about the containment, the costs related to containment. This is, of course, something politically and economically extremely important. And there are three types of cost, or two types of cost: economic cost. And our proposal is, and we have shown it in the cooperation with Daniel Gros, that the economic cost of the social distancing can be expressed as a reduction of the reproduction factor with a given prefactor, which we estimated from real-world data. So that's the key idea. If you do something, the reproduction factor is reduced, and you have economic costs which are more or less proportional. Then we, of course, have medical cost. Namely, one is the working time lost. If you're ill, you cannot go to work. The direct medical cost: if you are ill, you need treatment, intensive care, and you have the value of life. Let's say if you die with 50, you still had 30 years to live. That's a life expectancy. And we assume that 1 year of human life is worth 1 kilo euro. Then that you die costs the society about 3 million euros. So that is also something which is normally taken into account. And I don't want into the details, but then you can do simulations, estimate the total cost, and you will find that long-term containment policies are the best. Now, as I said, we want to compare with experiments, with real-world data. And here the lines are theory lines. So the controlled theory model can be solved exactly, analytically, as we have done. And then you can fit the data which you have for different countries, here for Germany, for Italy, and for the United Kingdom. And for the first wave, we did that here for the first wave. And you see, you can fit pretty well. And of course, the real-world data is a little bit noisy. And then you can calculate or evaluate the ratio of long-term containment policy relative to the overall containment policy. And you see, for Germany, it was about 50%. So this is the German curve. So 50% of the feedback of the policy can be evaluated or termed to be a long-term component. Of course, that was only during the first wave, and it changed dramatically afterwards. If you take, on the other hand, the United Kingdom, only 7% of the component of the containment policies was long-term, and all the rest were short-term meddling around. And if you do short-term containment policies, of course, you don't manage to suppress the infection as much as with long-term, because once you have reached a certain level, you're starting to relax. That you can see here more explicitly also. This is some not real-world data, but some simulation result. The blue lines here are two versions of short-term control, and the green lines are two versions of long-term control. And you see that long-term control is much more effective than short-term control. As I said, because essentially the short-term control, when you're happy, you start to relax and you don't get the disease really down. What we did also here is make an experiment. Namely, here we increased the testing for the COVID-19 to say by a factor of 2, which we can model with our, which we can represent with our model. And of course, you see that the more you test, the better it is, because we can reduce here the number of infections. Of course, this is a model calculation. It doesn't mean that in real life, if you would do it now out in some city, it is so easy that you really get a dramatic reduction of the disease directly. But I will come to that. It is, of course, will happen. I would also like to mention that outbreaks can be stopped completely without a vaccine. So here's the case of New Zealand. Now, of course, it's an island. It's much easier. They have the first wave here, like everybody else. After the first wave, it essentially was corona-free. Now they have a little bit of influx because they're not completely isolated. People travel to New Zealand. But if you look at the absolute numbers, an incidence of 0.2 is ridiculously low compared to European standards. And as the president of New Zealand says, she always says, go early, go hard, and then you manage to, to suppress the disease. And in our modeling language, it corresponds to strong long-term control. Now, I'm coming here to the end already because we want to have plenty of time for discussion. I have two more transparencies. The question is then, what went wrong in Europe? Why do we have this big second wave or third wave in nearly all countries? We believe that one of the major impacts, of course, there are different issues here, but of the major impact is that we don't have enough testing. So the testing capacity in Germany, for example, raised only from 0.3 million per week to 0.1 million per week, which is what we have now. And that is probably an order of magnitude too small. In other countries, it's not very, people don't like comparison with China, but in China, they have the capacity to test a whole city with 5 or 10 million people in a few days. This has nothing to do with the political system, it's just a technical capacity to test people. There are two misunderstandings with mass testing, which are often raised. One is that it cannot be possible in a free society because of data protection. That is not the case. Because how would you do mass testing? Well, if you have a certain region with a high incidence, you can calculate how many people you have to test to find people who are infectious, to send them into the quarantine, and to reduce in this way the G factor. You can calculate that. That is what epidemiology is for. Now, let's say it's 20% of the population, of the local population you have to test. Well, then you just say to the population, you have choices. So we do a test campaign, and if we reach 20%, we don't need a lockdown. If we don't reach this 20%, we need a lockdown. Then everybody is free to go to voluntary testing or not. So it's absolutely possible. The second misunderstanding is it's not possible because you need high quality testing, like the PCR test. That's not the case, because in mass testing, it is not the aim to find everybody. It's just the aim to find enough people to reduce the R factor substantially below 1. You can do that with lower qualities fast tests. You will get false positives, but these false positives you can then rule out with secondary testing. In our opinion, also the second reason why we have the second wave is because most policies after the first wave concentrated on short-term control. We see that all the summer time here in Germany, if the number of cases were not high, people were happy, government happy, and essentially no strategy for the second wave was really developed. At least no continuous strategies which has been published in the which is available to the public information. Now, in other countries like South Korea, I will show that later on, and Japan have managed to control the disease. So what went wrong? So quite a few people believe it's our societal system. In a free society like we have, it's just not possible to control a disease. Now, that is, of course, very difficult to give arguments pro and contra this point of view. My personal point of view is this is an excuse. For example, just to give a personal experience, I see here on the campus, here in Frankfurt, in the restaurants, I see people closely packed together at lunchtime with no worries about Corona. That has nothing to do with free society. It only has to do with responsibility. The other possibility is it's the fault of the science advisors. They didn't develop a long-term strategies. And we don't know exactly what's happening here, but to give a personal impression, I was reading in the last day quite a few interviews of science advisors regarding the second wave. And I was a little bit disappointed because they're very good people, very good scientists, but there was no in-depth analysis why the second wave happened. Could we have, how could we have avoided it? And what about the third and the fourth wave? Instead, in all these interviews, I only read the standard arguments, what we have to do, lockdown, reduce contacts, and stuff like that. Finally, and Daniel may be able to say something, maybe the governments were a little bit lazy in this sense. They were happy that during summer times nothing happened and no long-term control strategies was built up. So whoever it is, we cannot really say, but the question is it all past, or is there still need to do something because the disease is not over? And then the question becomes my last slide, and the question is, how many waves can we expect? How many coronavirus waves can we expect? I took here as an example Israel. We could have taken another example, which is about one, maybe a second or third wave, depending how you count. And you see the typical time scale is about 2 months, from here to here. About 1 month to ramp up, 1 month to go down, if you have strict lockdown measuring it here at the top of the wave. And so maybe you have a little bit quiet period afterwards, but nothing changed. So our best guess is that after that, we will have here another wave coming up and another wave coming up. So another wave, lockdown, another wave, lockdown, and so on. And this will go on until, well, either winter finishes or we have an vaccination. Now in this plot, which is also from our webpage, there's also South Korea and Japan. And you say, oh, maybe something must have been completely wrong because I cannot really distinguish South Korea and Japan, 2 free countries, 2 democratic countries. What went wrong? Well, nothing went wrong because the incidence in these 2 countries is ridiculously low for European levels. You just don't see it on this scale. So it is possible to control the disease. We don't do that. We prefer, in a certain sense, to have periodic lockdowns. Well, I know that these statements are a little bit controversial, but that is the aim of the discussion, and hopefully we have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. And so this is my short presentation, and now passing back to our moderator,
Thank you, Claudius.
Roser Valenti.
Thank you, Claudius. Before we go into the discussion, so I would like to invite Daniel to give some statements more on the policies aspect, and then we go into the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roser. I cannot add on the mathematical modeling, but perhaps a bit on the policy side. There are a couple of factors which I would like to discuss right now. One is that as we modeled also, these containment measures have an economic cost. And actually, I'm right now in a little project where, together with a colleague, I look at the correlation of this famous Oxford indicator of governmental restrictions and the evolution of output GDP in Europe. And what we find is that there's a very strong impact of any increase in the restrictions on output growth. Interestingly enough, by the way, you find very little impact on employment, because in Europe we have all these Kurzarbeiter schemes and others, which means that people are kept in employment. If I look at the United States, actually I find an extremely strong impact of these same measures, which are differentiated by state of the United States, right? So there you don't look at the United States as one entity, but at the 50 different states. And you find that whenever a state introduces some of these restrictions, which could be on closing schools, closing restaurants. People are forbidden to move across state boundaries or these things. Then you find an immediate impact on local employment. So one can actually measure how much the immediate economic cost is of these restrictions. Now, in the model that we have in our paper, in which Claudius presented, you can actually look at this, these initial costs as a sort of investment. You pull down or push down the economy at the same time you get the diffusion of the virus down to a level so that you can then go into track and tracing and keep it there, as South Korea and Japan have done very successfully, as you have seen. So what went wrong in Europe, I think, were two things. Perhaps the restrictions were lifted too early because politicians and society were too impatient. They said, okay, infections are already now at a much lower level. That is the short-sighted control which Claudius talked about. Why don't we relax? And then comes a second aspect which should also not be overlooked, which is the seeding from abroad. Because there was a great demand here in Europe to open frontiers, borders, and to allow people to travel. And when people travel, of course, they can bring back into their country seeding, meaning they can catch it abroad and bring it back. And this is where what Claudius said came into effect. You can deal with the seeding if you have the appropriate testing capacity. Remember, at one point there was talk about testing all people coming back from vacation, but that was not done because the testing capacity wasn't there. And then, of course, if you have continuous seeding and then slowly you go above your test and trace capacity, then you have a second wave. So that was, as Claudius said, that there was insufficient testing capacity, partially for one reason, which is that some people in the government thought we have a private sector and that private sector should have an incentive to actually produce enough tests because they gain from tests, they make money, they make profit. What people who follow this thought don't realize is that every test has what is called an externality, an external effect. That's how we call it in economics, when the benefit of a test for the producer is just the 10 euros profit they perhaps make. The benefit to society is that you know who is infectious or not, even if you don't know it with 100% certainty. And if you can actually prevent an infectious person running around and infecting other people, society gains a lot. And the private producers of tests don't take this externality into account. And I think that was another failure of policy, to take into account that the market in some cases doesn't always know best. So I think this is these are some of the parameters which led to the fact that we got it down in Europe and in Germany in particular to very low level, where test and tracing a la Korea might have worked, but then a combination of seeding from abroad, opening the frontiers, then led to this slowly increasing case count. What they talk here in politics, it's what they call the paradox of prevention. It's very difficult to show people why some measures were necessary if there are no cases. Because if you're really very good, as in South Korea and Japan, then you don't have any cases. And you cannot tell people, look, right, this is what we avoided. They don't see anything. And as Claudius earlier said, that's a test for societies that you can actually support, you, meaning the population, the political institutions, can support measures that might be costly in the short run and which do not seem to be justified by the current case count, but are justified by the need to keep it prospectively under control and make this investment. And I think this is what was at the basis of this failure of policy. You have a society which is short-sighted and for which it is very difficult to justify large economic costs of the type I mentioned earlier in the absence of a case count. And if you don't do that, then of course you can have repeated waves. Jose, let me stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. And now the screen is open for discussion. I see that there is a first chat from Geisler. Maybe you could put just your question shortly if you turn on your micro. No?
Do you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Inside the body there's taking place a lot of different things as compared to the outside, and which could in turn react back to what's happening outside. What we talk about always. I guess you are familiar with Lyme borreliosis and such thing. These are bacteria which are at first accessible to the immune system, but after a while they hide away in some areas in the body which are not accessible to the immune system, and there are no symptoms. And after a while, triggered by stress or so, they come again back and give rise to symptoms, bad symptoms. And the guy may then be infectious too. So it's the same on the flu can be the same thing. The flu is also such a thing. The normal flu, there are a lot of things going on. So even if you don't see anything but a small amount of COVID disease, many of the population may still be hosting the virus. And since they do not couple, because they are not immediately infectious, they have not really immediate effect. Only after maybe stress or bad condition, another illness, or unfavorable weather, or they neglect contact limitations, so that the virus load, the external virus load, may rise and meet with a worse condition of the body, the effect can return.
Sorry for cutting you. So basically your question is, how do you account for cases where it's not obvious that there are symptoms, right? So let me just shorten, but I think this is your question.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, it's because otherwise we won't be able, but I think this is your question. So maybe
I just want to say that can if you put this in the model, and the coherence effect, then you will have a model for the conditions where the peak can return and continue to return after a while and so on.
Yeah, so maybe Claudius, if you want to answer the question.
Well, this is similar to the, it's a good point, of course, but this is similar to the Sears model where you lose immunity. So in your case, you are never really losing immunity because the disease is always in your body, but hiding and coming out. But on a functional level, that is, of course, the epidemiological mechanism is a different one. On functionally, it can be modeled by the Sears model. So Sears model that you can get infectious afterwards. And it's true that it's very well known. For example, measles, as you said, there are strong coherence effect. If that is the case, in the measles in the 50s, when it was not controlled, you could look at English city and count the measles effect, and you could see that two cities maybe would be having exactly the same measles peak, so every 2 or 3 years, and they would be in coherence.
Yeah.
But at the moment, I think there's not, I'm not sure whether there's evidence that this is a strong effect for COVID-19. Maybe on the longer run, but on here now on the time scale of a few months, I haven't yet seen a discussion about that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jens Müller?
Yeah, my question is, besides the reproduction parameter, there's also the dispersion, which is related to cluster formation, which is often called the super spreading phenomenon. Can that be modeled, or do you have, can you take this into account, that people are more infectious than others?
Of course. So what we did was, epidemiologists do that. I mean, that is standard, let's say, daily work for virologists and theoretical epidemiologists. And the models can be pretty complicated and take account all kinds of things. For example, I've seen a model of Portland where they had an agents, 1.8 million agents, modeling the traveling behavior, the dining behavior, the social status of all these 1.8 million people, putting them, having then an epidemic on top of that, and you could then exactly see if they reduce going to work by that and that, the contact frequencies goes down like that and that. So, and of course you can also introduce super spreader there, people a certain percentage. So our approach was a little bit differently. Our approach was to have a framework where you can say, if you have a certain type of policies, can you, let's say, on an abstract level, say what kind of effect it would have? And it's in this sense more like a theoretical approach.
Thank you. We have a question by Theo de Royce.
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, yes.
That's fine. I have quite simple question. First of all, thank you very much for explaining this model you have described for modeling the first wave for this controlled SIR model. And I'm curious if you did some predictions also for the second wave. Of course, you have to take some assumptions for the parameters, I think. But did you do some calculations concerning this second wave?
So if I answer, no, we didn't. And the reason is that the type of policies change dramatically. So, and then you would have to estimate at any time step what kind of policies you have, what kind of containment policies you have. And now during the first wave, to our analysis, containment policies were more or less constant. So in a sense, the government followed one type of policies and didn't change them. Then we can explain that first wave. But afterwards, containment policies changes. And then we would have, of course, we could do that, putting that as an explicit parameter, then it's time dependent. And so then you have a day-to-day epidemiological modeling, which can be done, but which we didn't do that.
Okay, thanks.
The next
question
is...
Can I add
yes,
one
please,
thing?
Daniel, please.
What might also be different, and I didn't want to go into that, is that the G0 parameter might be different because it is seasonal, right? You know that some people have said that in indoor environments, the rate of infection is 19 times, higher than outdoors. And if with the approaching winter, people just meet more indoors, then ceteris paribus, all the governmental restrictions, of course, the the reproduction rate you observe would go up, and it would go up much more, and the case count would go up much more quickly than in the first wave. And that might be partially the case.
Thank you. The next question or comment is by Sultan Neda about PCR tests.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Claudius, and thanks for the nice homepage. It will be really useful for people who will do modeling in the future. But my question considers the PCR testing. So you know that the way they do it, they have a given number of PCR cycles, and after 40 cycles, as I know well, if they detect any amount of virus, they say it's positive. And PCR tests do not measure the viral load. And since they do not measure the viral load, we don't really know how infectious those people are or how severe they will be affected by the virus. And I see nobody is making now some attempts to get optimal PCR cycles when they declare that this person is positive or it is not. And if you are increasing the number of PCR tests, which is happening now in Europe, so all countries are increasing the number of tests, definitely we will detect many people with a very small number of virus in it. And this could be the reason why you see that the number of positive people are going up and the number of deaths are not going up so strongly now in Germany. So could you somehow maybe comment on this one? Do you consider that this testing is really relevant?
Well, as you very well know, Zoltan, so I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm a theoretical physics. And all what you say is, of course, exactly on the point. And there should be studies making a correlation between that. And maybe there are, we don't know about that. So I only can say I've read about the studies in the United States where they systematically every week since they started, they looked at the infected people and statistically looked at the virus load, so how infectious they are. But this was specific studies. And I don't know whether they made this correlation with the cycle, but I just know that this dropped dramatically since the spring, because maybe people are a little bit more careful. And then even if you get infectious, you don't get the full load. But your point is very valid, and hopefully that's being done here.
Okay, thank you.
So our next question is by Falco Pientka.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks also for the very nice talk. I would like to ask about this difference between long-term and short-term measures that you distinguished in your model. And you said that early on, apparently there was a relatively high share of long-term measures in the German response. And you seem to suggest that this is not the case anymore now. Can you, again, once more make clear what's the distinction between the two? And do you have some ideas on what's in the public policy? How does that reflect in the public policy? Or what does that specifically mean?
Yeah, so our model is really an extremely simplified model. So the idea is, of course, you can model day-to-day policy changes. But we say, is there one parameter where can I explain or fit the whole outbreak, of course, only of one wave, And it seems yes. So we can fit essentially all first wave outbreaks seen in the world, more or less. Actually, we have two parameters. One is the short-term control and one is the long-term control. And the long-term control, the idea is correct as a total case count. You say, oh, the total number of deaths is important because in the evening news, normally, at least in Germany, you give both. Oh, so many people died today, and the total count now is 10,000, whatever. And either one makes impression to you or the other one makes impression. And so just having these two parameters. Of course, it's a very simplified model. But when the policies changes, when people say, now we're going, it's like a phase transition in physics, we're going to a completely different state, then you have to change the model. And that's why we are now in a completely different state than we had before in the first place. But
Thank you.
It's external transition, it's externally induced transition.
Okay, so thank you. The next question is for Daniel by Manuel Lorenz.
Yeah, also from my side, thank you very much for the talks and the comments. I have more question to the political side. I think you gave the argument that more testing would have helped if we would have a factor 10 more, or if the market had more motivation to go for higher testing. Yet I feel that the interest in the population and long-term measurements was constantly decreasing over summer, and we had all these protests. And my question is, does not one always run into these problems, no matter how high the test capacities are, that at some point then people don't expect to wear masks anymore or something like this, and you always run into that situation where you cannot control your seats anymore. And then if this is the case, then is there some perspective to get the population interested or better aware of this interest in long-term acceptance of them, like wearing a mask in supermarkets or something like this?
Thanks. Let me link my reply also to the previous question. I mean, when we modeled the first outbreak, we assumed that there are certain policy reaction parameters which are constant and which could be either the short-term or the long-term type, right? And in the short-term type, basically, as things go better, you immediately loosen, right? And that then doesn't bring you all the way down to where you can have a phased transition, as Claudius called it, where you go to tracking and testing. And somebody observed that Germany had a relatively high long-term weight, a very high weight on the long-term. And you're saying, but now Germany is again going up, but relative to other countries, you still see a difference.
Yeah, but...
right? So there's one thing is Germany in absolute, right? And then Germany in relation to the others, it might still be a bit less bad off because there's a little bit more of long-term thinking, right? And acceptance. Now, let me come back on the tests. That's very important because the testing and tracking is actually meant to be a substitute for the mask wearing, the social distancing, and so on. The efficiency of your tracking and testing very much depends how much seeding, for example, you can still keep under control, right? Let me make another example. If you know that when people travel, right, they bring back more seed and being more infectious. You could say the airport taxes now contains the cost for a test, or maybe for 2 tests, when you're leaving and when you're coming back, right? That would be a way to A, discourage people to travel, and B, also to keep then the seeding under control, comma, of course, if you have the capacity. And there, of course, the companies will not build up enormous test capacity for 2 weeks when everybody returns from the vacations in the summer. But the government should have built up the capacity, it's mainly machines, right? To have 2 machines at every airport and make sure that you can test anybody who returns. So that was my point. You can actually ask less from the population, the stronger is your testing and tracking system.
Yeah, but my point is more like if we would have done this in summer and tested all the people which were coming back from traveling, and we would probably be better off yet, but would we not hit this rise in 2 or 3 weeks? Because then measurements against it, I mean, I think we would also be better off now if we would have done this part lockdown 2 weeks ago when the federal ministers were meeting already and they discussed, and yet they did not do it. And then Chancellor Merkel said something like, okay, then we're sitting in 2 weeks again here, and this is how it happened. So
but that's my point. That's now an empirical question. Yeah. Could we have achieved basically the South Korean or Japanese solution with no increase? So keeping with tracking and tracing the R number under control, right?
Yeah.
Which of course means that you do many more tests than are absolutely needed. And if you do that, if you do it a little bit, maybe it is true what you said. In the end, but just 2 weeks later, you come to the same result. But it could also be that you flatten the curve so much that it really remains flat, and then you don't have to do it.
Yeah, but I think in the societies like South Korea or Japan, people are much more caring about the society itself and not about themselves. I think that's also a problem of our society. I think in the US it's even worse because they fear that their freedom is taken away from them if they have to do something like this. So I think
if you look at it, actually, if I may continue, was there?
Yeah, sorry.
You find that the countries which dealt with the disease best were those which had the experience of SARS.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't just freedom loving, right? It is also a lot that made that experience once, right? And that then increases the acceptability of long-term thinking, right?
May I also add a small comment? What
Very small.
What Manuel was saying, that that is of course true. So that we would have here in Germany a harder time, but I still believe, of course, as Dani says, if we increase testing enough, we still would have been able to contain the epidemics. Of course, relatively to South Korea, we would have to have a bigger effort because, as you said there, or Dani said there, the people are a little bit more compliant because of their previous experience. But this would just have cost a few billion euros more, but we have this money. So yes, we would have to do more than South Korea and Japan, but we could have done that.
Okay, thank you very much.
So we have a question from Hartmut Roskos about the word policy. Hartmut, can you put your question?
Yes, actually, it's a question and perhaps a remark. I'm a bit concerned about the use of the word policy. Policy means acting, having plans, implementing plans, taking actions. But if I understand this model correctly, in this policy factors is a lot of reaction, right? What happens with the population? For example, when the young people think, oh, the disease for us is not so severe, so why should I accept all these measures that I suffer already from for 1 year or something like this? This is also included effectively in these parameters. Now, my concern is some people who read about your model and then read always about policy factors and whether it works or not works, and right, and one is tempted to assign blame. And I would advise, if I'm not mistaken with my interpretation of what these policy parameters mean, I would suggest to you to use another word and not policy, because you load the thing with political implication and finger pointing that I think is very troublesome. That was my question/remark.
Okay, who wants to answer the question?
Daniel, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I agree. We could just call it policy reaction.
Yeah, or interaction parameter or something like this.
Okay,
I would leave the word policy out completely, because you see, wouldn't you agree, let's say, if suddenly the opinion of a large part of the population, like the young people, changes, they take the responsibility for the first 2 months, for the first 3 months, suddenly they see, oh, damn, I'm not getting very sick. Why should I do that, right? Why not have a party? And if I just stay a little bit away from my old people, nobody cares. This thing, in your terms, is a policy. But it's not, right? It's not an active dealing by people who want to take control. It's a reactive phenomenon. Has, in my opinion, nothing whatsoever to do with policy. So I would really suggest to take out the word policy, because again, always when you use it, I heard that even now in the presentation by Claudius Gros, there is always a hint of finger pointing, and that's dangerous in this situation.
Okay. As an economist, we have many policy reaction functions for monetary policy, fiscal policies, and others. But okay, I'm flexible on the use of words.
Okay, so
I will have to leave, Roser,
yes,
sorry.
Yes, that's fine. That's fine. In fact, we are coming into an end. So to our colloquium and discussion. If there are not, I don't see now more comments or questions. And
I would like to
yes,
ask
Dimitri,
something. Hello.
please.
But we can also chat afterwards if this is like.
It's okay. It's okay. It's just
too
Daniel
late.
that has to leave, but Claudius and me, we are here. So Dimitri, please.
Yeah, okay. So I like quite a lot this idea that more testing would just simply suppress kind of the outbreak, because basically effectively you are putting like infectious people into this group of not infectious or like reduced infectious, right? So now if we compare to Japan and Korea, they're kind of, let's say, more or less similar in size to Germany. So what is actually the number of tests they were producing per week? Do we have this information? I mean, for me, it's actually quite difficult to access anywhere publicly how much test any country is doing. Like even Germany, it is just like not shared. So I mean, this would be kind of important to at least test this. I mean, prediction.
Dimitri, yes. So to everybody, we are also working with Dimitri on COVID-19. Very good point. I think we and you, we together, we have to follow that up.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Can I make a fast comment? I added here a website that I'm often looking into, and they list here for every country the number of total testing and also I think in time scales. This one, and I know that I also look at another website where they have this number. So I don't know how valid they are, but these numbers are at least they are given there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, that's very good. There is one more question from Theo de Royce to Claudius.
Yes, it's just coming back to your controlled SIR model. I just was questioning myself concerning the parameters, if I have understood it correctly. So you have the parameter alpha x for short-term control, and you have the parameter alpha I for long-term control. Could you elaborate?
Yeah.
Yes, could you elaborate a little bit what you mean exactly? Does it cover containment? Does it also cover testing? Or what does it exactly mean?
Well, let me just share again.
Yes, exactly. That's the right page.
To be honest, it is much simpler, namely in the sense that it is just an effective model how exactly the reproduction factor G or R, which enters the Sears model, is reduced when numbers go up. Which is the exact functional dependence. So if the total number of cases goes up, then G is reduced exactly like that. If the total number, if the daily number of cases goes up or down, G is reduced exactly by that. And alpha I models also spontaneous, as Hartmann was saying, it's not really a policy. Here, spontaneous social distancing or governmental decision to do lockdown or some other containment possible. Measure.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Exactly means this functional dependency and nothing more.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
There is one more, wait a second. There is one more question or comment by Herrn Geisler. Will be our last question.
Yeah, thank you for taking me at last. Is the epidemiologic system of equations made up of the equations you showed in the beginning of your talk, Mr. Gros, combined with diffusion equations?
You can do that, yeah.
Yeah, there is some. Okay, so I can look it up and find
yeah,
it.
That's all done. You can do it on a network. You can do it with diffusion. You can do that, yeah.
Under your internet
no,
page,
we didn't do that, but many people do that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think we are reaching the end of this colloquium. I now pass it back to Jens Müller, if you want to say some final words, and we close the colloquium. From my side, I would like to thank everybody for being there and for the really lively discussion. And Jens, it's now your screen.
I cannot do more than you just did. So thank you very much, Roser, Claudius, and Daniel for giving this very nice presentation, and thanks for this website. So I will also take a look at this now more often. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and see you sometime later when the next colloquium will take place like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everybody.